I went to India to kill myself. In a way, I got my wish. Life had become a bleak, colorless prison, built from invisible chains, money, cubicles, bad food, restless sleep. I was 2 years out of college, staring down a future that felt like a straight, unbroken line. A drone in the machine. My days were numb. Wake up too early, sit in a chair for hours while my mind screamed from the boredom, drive home, eat, sleep, repeat. Was this life? It didn't feel like it. I held out for a year, pretending it could get better. But I couldn't be a cog forever. I saw the homeless every day, their eyes hollow, their existence is slow-motion suicide. I knew I wouldn't go out like that. If I was going to end it, I would end it on my terms. So I spent everything I had on a one-way ticket to India. It was supposed to be different, an escape, a new world. But it wasn't. It was just another prison, wrapped in a different skin. The coffee shops, the crowds, the monotony, all the same, just with different faces. When the money ran out, so did my hope. I begged for enough change to buy a bottle of sleeping pills. They were cheap. Swallowing them all at once seemed easy, like drifting off into sleep. I found a dark corner, sat down, and waited for it to end. I don't remember falling asleep. But when I woke up, I wasn't free. It felt like I was underwater, drowning, but rising, breaking the surface. But instead of fresh air, my head slammed into wood hard, close, suffocating. My fingers scraped the rough surface above me, inches from my face. Dark, so dark. And the air thin, heavy. My legs. I tried to stretch, but they were bent at awkward angles, numb, yet burning with pain. Blood flow had been cut off for too long. I clenched my fists against the agony until it faded. Then the truth hit me like a weight. I was in a box, a small wooden box. I pushed against the sides, but they wouldn't budge. It wasn't strong wood, no. It was weak, brittle, but something outside was pressing against it, holding it in place. Oh God, the pills, they didn't kill me. They must have thought I was dead. They buried me alive. The panic clawed at my throat as I screamed, pounded at the thin wood. Dust trickled down, then dirt, then more dirt, pouring in like an hourglass. The air grew thinner, my lungs gasping, burning. I'd suffocate soon if I didn't find a way out. I had no choice but to keep tearing at the wood. More dirt spilled in, but I kept going until sunlight. A crack. A sliver of light, faint but real. I breathed it in like the sweetest air, even though it carried dirt with it. I screamed for help, my voice hoarse, raw. But there was no answer. Was I in a graveyard, alone, surrounded by the dead? Time blurred. The light dimmed, went dark, came back. I shouted again, desperate, but no one came. Rain. I heard it. Felt the cool trickle of water seeping through the cracks. I drank it in, grateful for the few drops that reached me. The wood groaned under the weight of the wet earth. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I rolled onto my back, pressing my knees against the roof to keep it from collapsing on me. It wouldn't matter soon. If the dirt didn't bury me, the box would crush me. No one was coming. I wasn't strong enough to bash my way out. But the box could certainly collapse in on me and crush me if I didn't hold it up. How do I explain what it's like to be buried alive? Stories and movies always focus on the initial terror, the panic of waking up underground. But no one talks about what comes next, the endless waiting, thinking, guessing. Do I scream now or wait? Should I conserve my energy? Maybe when the dirt dries, I can try again to break through. I prayed for rain to quench my thirst, but dreaded it too, knowing too much would drown me. The thoughts went in circles, always the same hope and fear, mingled together. And always the box was there, pressing in from every side, a wooden prison that became part of me. Every knot, every grain of wood, I could feel them in the darkness, like a second skin. I supported that box with my strength, even though it was the very thing keeping me trapped inside. The box was death, but it was also life. For 2 days, no rain came. Then, just around noon, judging by the faint shaft of light, it arrived. Not a drizzle, but a storm. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life, though I was never the religious type. "Please," I whispered, "just a light rain." But the rain didn't listen. When water pooled around my body, filling the base of the box, I knew it was now or never. I shifted into a twisted pose, one that might have impressed a circus contortionist. Knees bent, arms braced under me, back pressed hard against the sagging roof. The wood bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed with everything I had left, straining against the weight above me. For a moment, I felt it, the earth shifting, the wood creaking under the pressure. I was making progress, maybe enough for someone to notice a tiny bump in the ground above. I imagined breaking free, feeling the rain on my face, gasping for fresh air. But my body gave out before I could make that vision a reality. I collapsed onto my back, breathless, exhausted. Something had moved, I was sure of it, but not enough. I needed more time, but the box had other plans. Without warning, it caved in on top of me. Dirt poured in from every side, filling the tiny space. I fought against it, clawing at the flow, but there was too much. I found a small air hole and pressed my mouth to it, desperate to avoid suffocation. But the dirt kept coming, burying me deeper. Soon, my mouth was the only part of me still exposed to the air. The rest of my body was encased, trapped under the earth. And the rain, it was getting heavier. I drank what I could of the rainwater, even swallowing bits of mud that slid down with it. Anything to keep that narrow opening clear, but it didn't last. The rain overwhelmed me, filling the hole. I had to close my mouth. I held my breath. That was it then. There were no more chances, no more desperate attempts. I had come to India to die, even tried to end it with pills. And yet here I was, fighting tooth and nail, clinging to life with every last breath, even as the earth pressed down on me. Ironic, wasn't it? I had wanted death, but now I would do anything to survive, even for one more minute. The rainwater pooled above my mouth, growing heavier. I wondered how long Olympic divers could hold their breath. 3 minutes? 4? I'd seen it on TV once, flipping through channels, back when life was just routine. 60 seconds, 61, 62. My chest burned with pressure, the urge to breathe unbearable. What should I think about in my final moments? The girls I dated? My favorite movies? It all seemed meaningless, and yet at that moment, it was everything. The smallest, most mundane things felt like treasures I'd never experience again. I would have given anything just to feel the fabric of my office cubicle one last time, to take one more breath. Thunder boomed overhead, so loud I could hear it even through the suffocating layers of dirt. I wish I could say the storm saved me, that the hillside gave way and I was swept free in a landslide. That's what the doctors and local police claimed later, that I was just a traumatized foreigner, confused by the experience of being buried alive. But they didn't listen. They refused to believe the truth. I wasn't saved by the rain. I wasn't saved at all. At 140 seconds, just as my awareness began to fade into a shimmering white void, I felt something. Not from above, but below. Something cold, something unnatural, wrapping around my legs, tugging, pulling me down. In the last moment before I blacked out, I gasped, dirt filling my lungs, and yet somehow I was still alive. Something was dragging me deeper into the earth. I'd been dropped somewhere, soft, wet lumps and hard, unforgiving lines pressing against me. The air was thick, foul, yet breathable. For a moment, I stayed still, just letting myself exist, savoring that thin thread of life. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I didn't want to face it. Not until I opened my eyes. I finally willed them open, but nothing changed. Still dark. No light. Crawling, I felt my way across the shifting piles beneath me. Solid objects clattered together in the dark bones, brittle and clacking. Thick, soft lumps rolled as I dragged myself over them. I was already suspicious, but the truth didn't hit me until my hand landed on something cold and fleshy, something unmistakable. A face. A corpse. It tumbled down the pile of bones I'd been crawling over. My heart raced, but I still couldn't see a thing. I didn't have to. I knew now. I was in a graveyard, buried under the earth, where rain had washed bodies into a hidden cave. I was alive for now, but this was worse than the box. At least in the box, I could scream, shout, pray that someone might hear me. Down here, I was in a field of the dead. No one would ever come. No one would ever know. I thought about starving to death, buried under corpses, surviving only as long as new bodies slid down to join me, their decay feeding me in some grotesque cycle. God, what if I never died? What if there was always just enough water, just enough human flesh, to keep me going for years? Decades? Could I even bring myself to eat a corpse? The thought was unbearable. Funny though, when I was trapped in the box, I hadn't cried. There, everything was simple. You fight or you die. But here, it was different. Loneliness, hunger, they would twist me, turn me into something else, a monster. I crawled for hours, maybe longer, across the pit. My hands felt the sides, but they were solid, packed hard by years of erosion. No way out. For a brief, desperate moment, I thought about building a ladder out of bones. There were certainly enough. And strips of clothing, hair, they could tie it all together. But before I could act on the thought, something happened. A door opened. There was no light, just the quiet hiss of metal sliding open. Warm air flowed in, a strange contrast to the cold, stale breath of the pit. I moved toward the sound immediately, instinctively. But I wasn't alone. Something else was down there with me, something that moved in the darkness. I heard the soft shuffle of bodies being disturbed, bones shifting as something dragged them away. Whatever it was, it moved quickly, silently, and it took something with it. I chased it, diving toward the gap that hadn't been there before. I made it through just before the door shut. Warm metal greeted my hands, smooth and strangely comforting. It wasn't just a grate or a drain cover, it was solid. I ran my hands along it, feeling its strange, alien patterns. I could open the door from the inside if I wanted to go back. But no, hell no. I pressed on, crawling, slithering. I didn't know how long that warm, living tunnel stretched on. The darkness warped my sense of time, my sense of distance. I moved until my arms grew weak, and then I dragged myself forward on my elbows. Whatever this tunnel was, it was leading me somewhere. It had to be. I slept, curled against the soft hum of the metal. It felt alive, as if it was breathing, its rhythm rising and falling like some distant sleeping creature. How long had I been underground? A week? Longer? For the first time in days, I found hope again. I wasn't alone. When I woke, I crawled onward, slow but determined. The tunnel finally opened into a chamber, and there was light, dim, gray, but light. I felt a spark of joy, like I hadn't seen anything in years. But that joy quickly turned to dread. The chamber wasn't a sanctuary, it was a mortuary. The tunnel's sleek metal walls expanded into a twisted maze of overlapping pipes. Some of them bulged upward, forming crude tables, and on those tables lay corpses, 6 of them. Some were fresh, others decayed, reduced to little more than bones. 2 tables stood empty, waiting for their next guests. I had gone from bad to worse, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Being buried alive had stripped away all my fear. Death? It wasn't the worst thing that could happen. I had to keep moving. There were more tunnels ahead, none of them looking official. This place wasn't built for the living. I crawled forward, deeper into the unknown, into whatever hell was waiting for me next. I crawled into the pipelined hole, hiding in the shadows as I heard something sighing just outside. As I squeezed myself deeper into the darkness, I watched in horror as an enormous organic metallic appendage, jointed like a grotesque marionette, slid in without a sound. It moved with an unsettling grace, reaching down into the pile of corpses and dragging the farthest one away into the abyss. This was the creature that had invaded the sinkhole. This was what I had stolen bodies from. I was now an unwitting witness to this nightmarish ritual as the appendage retreated, dragging the body into the gloom. My heart thundered in my chest, fear coursed through my veins. I had nowhere else to go. As I inched forward, I caught my breath, only to come face to face with a human skull, its eyes wide open, unseeing. It was set into the wall, but no, it wasn't merely a part of the wall. It was a gate, a grotesque portal lined with smooth chrome tubes that had snaked in through the years, feeding into its gaping mouth and spinal cord. The ends of those connections gleamed like cruel spikes, remnants of a life that had once pulsated with energy. I followed the curve of the metallic cave, my senses heightened, until I stumbled upon what appeared to be twin operating rooms. Above each table hovered a steel bush of mechanical arms, each equipped with tiny, sharp instruments that loomed over the grotesque bulges of flesh lying on the tables. At first, I thought they were picking at the bodies, but as I crept closer, I realized that one arm had just deposited a fresh corpse before departing into the shadows. The body on the left table was long decayed, but its tiny claws were still intact, grasping at the air while the surgical instruments, 6 to 10 feet long, dipped into a wide vat on the floor, filled with what appeared to be random pieces of human flesh. I almost stumbled into that vat, catching myself at the last second against the warm metal of the table. The surgical arms didn't even falter. They continued their grim work, indifferent to my presence. I pressed against the wall, my breath shallow, watching as they reconstructed the features of the lifeless figure. They didn't restore its hair or skin only, the muscles surrounding the skull. Then, with meticulous care, they plucked 2 lifeless eyes from the vat and inserted them into the hollow sockets. For the first time since being buried alive, I felt a strange sense of companionship, however twisted it was. Those eyes stared blankly upwards, devoid of life, no eyelids to blink, no muscles to move them. What were these machines doing? I shivered as I observed the iris slowly filling the inner portions of the skull where I could not see. It was as if they were stitching together something ancient and monstrous, binding a nervous system with a series of small, quick shocks. They fused the lungs, placed a heart between them, and in an instant, the table erupted in a cacophony of screams. I froze in terror, feeling the echoes reverberate through the chamber. Then, a primal instinct kicked in, and I leaped forward, hissing, "Shut up, it will hear you." The muscle-bound skull remained motionless, but the eyes focused on me, their gaze an eerie mix of fear and desperation. It struggled to draw a breath, and in a rasping voice, it uttered something in Hindi. I pressed a finger to my lips, "She." The reanimated figure repeated another sentence in that foreign tongue before closing its jaw, signaling that I needed to remain quiet. Was it a man or a woman? I couldn't tell, but the horror in its eyes haunted me as I climbed into another operating room. The same grotesque scene unfolded there, but this process was less advanced. The machines were pouring remnants from the vat, piecing together a spinal column for a cracked skull. I rocked back and forth, overwhelmed by the insanity of what I was witnessing. Had I lost my mind? I was still trapped in that sinkhole, but when I turned to glance over my shoulder, I could see those terrified, muscle-laden eyes watching me, waiting for salvation. The surgical arms continued their grim task, ignoring me as they worked on another human fragment, piece by piece. "I'll come back for you," I whispered to the figure on the table, longing to help, to do something. I listened as it murmured another sentence in Hindi, and I committed the words to memory, hoping I could translate them someday, if I ever made it back to the world above. The corridor led me through a cathedral-like expanse, where pools of black water festered under a skeletal ribcage of thick metal bones, dripping ichor from ancient tubing. The dim light shifted between gray and blue as I crawled across the vast valley of death, feeling an alien presence shift around me. Nothing in this twisted place was meant for humans, and as I pressed onward, the darkness grew thicker, wrapping around me like a shroud. I wasn't even sure if I was on the bottom, as the very concept of up and down had warped into an alien confusion. The walls melted into the ceiling into the floor, and everything seemed to tilt at an impossible angle, as if I were trapped in a nightmare where gravity itself had betrayed me. The entire place had grown haphazardly, as if a great malevolent force had twisted the metal into forms that were warm and pulsing with life. There wasn't a seam or welding mark in sight. It felt as though I was inside some monstrous creature, a hideous demon skull, suffocating beneath the weight of the earth itself. My mind reeled with the impossibility of it all. The next vast chamber I stumbled into was an abomination, a wall lined with hundreds of pairs of human legs jutting out grotesquely. This chamber was not meant for me. It was too much for a fragile mind to bear. I climbed ever upward, deeper into a suffocating blue light that pulsed with an unnatural intensity. At the apex, I discovered a room filled with dark, unsettling devices. On the far wall, a face was set into the metal, a woman's face with her eyes shut tight. Tubes snaked from her grotesquely swollen head, intertwining like serpents. I began to grasp something of this place's horrifying nature aging, growth, and some unfathomable change. I sensed a dark spirit lurking behind those closed eyelids, and I knew if she were to awaken and gaze in my direction, I would endure a fate far worse than death. I moved as silently as a ghost, stepping carefully from one rounded pipe to the next, my bare feet brushing against the cold metal. My gaze darted back and forth between her closed eyes and the path ahead. Just as I feared she would awaken, her lids fluttered open. I watched in horror as her eyes moved, sweeping across the room in a slow, unnatural motion. She didn't see me, and I clung to the wall, staring up at her chin. Her mouth didn't part, but I swore I could hear a low hum emanating from her being. I counted what felt like 2 eternal hours before her lids finally closed again, and I crept along the base of the wall, ascending a ramp that shifted from blue to a deep, unsettling violet. I kept climbing, ever higher, avoiding the lurking shadows and listening for any sign of movement. This place exuded a sleeping awareness, a monstrous machine that had awaited ages for intruders, running itself on some automatic cycle, always vigilant. Then I found it there, in the violet-hued basilica, where the light became agonizingly violent. I encountered a sleeping giant. It was mostly a fetus, but its head loomed like a grotesque brain, towering at least 10 or 15 times my height, suspended in a viscous dark ichor inside a glass tube that extended from a biomedical base to the ceiling, unfathomably high above me. As I stared in abject horror, I tried to comprehend this nightmare. The creature's brain pulsed and contracted slowly, a brief movement aided by thick tubes that fed it. It was just one of many in this cathedral, an abomination surrounded by massive pillars and colonnades. I stood at the center of this grotesque structure, understanding for the first time the grim purpose of this space. Had they awakened, those 12 grotesque beings would have floated above, watching me with judgmental eyes, ready to pass their verdict. This was a court of some inhuman lineage, and we were all guilty. I ran, no longer caring about stealth. My bare feet pounded against the metal, echoing through the basilica until I burst into the darkness beyond. I was sure lights still glimmered somewhere, but beyond the violet haze, human eyes could not penetrate. I kept climbing, hour after hour, sometimes upward, sometimes downward, until I found myself wedged in a narrow tube, barely wide enough for my body to squeeze through. Somehow, I had become disoriented, and I emerged back in the operating chamber. The room felt familiar, yet wrong, as if I had come full circle. Above me, a woman lay on the operating table, her ribcage fitted with biomechanical adaptations, skin grafted and fusing together under the cold gaze of medical lasers. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with confusion. Was it me she recognized, or the madness of this accursed place? I had been right about the lack of any sense of orientation here. I climbed the wall, my direction shifting with every movement. I realized I could have been walking on walls or ceilings without knowing it, trapped in a perpetual state of disorientation. The only question that lingered was where the hell I truly was, and the only escape seemed to lead back to the very hell I had just traversed. I sat in silence with the woman, knowing we shared an unbridgeable chasm of language, our fates entwined in this nightmarish labyrinth. All we could do was sit there in dreadful silence, waiting and praying the larger claw would soar by at regular intervals. I watched its twisted arm writhe and stretch as it worked its way down the line, stealing life from the dead. I imagined other operating rooms, other graveyards stripped of their remains below. This was death. This was the afterlife, in every haunting sense. We buried them deep in this wretched place, only to reclaim their remains and rebuild them for grotesque purposes. There was nothing I could do. The table in the right chamber was busy reconstructing an entire skeleton, while the Hindu woman beside me lay half rebuilt, a hideous fusion of metal and flesh. She struggled against her restraints as the large arm descended upon her. Her scream echoed, but it was quickly silenced by a metal mask clamped over her mouth, twisting her cries into muffled whimpers. I stood paralyzed, clutching the cold, damp walls, as the claw returned to its gruesome task, depositing yet another pile of bones and leaving the surgical table to its grim work. It didn't care about me, nothing here did. I drifted through those ghastly halls, a ghost among the remains. There was nothing to learn, nothing to see, nothing to figure out. No tools, no exits. Starvation gnawed at my insides, but I refused to succumb. Whole vats of flesh sat temptingly nearby, but I couldn't bring myself to partake. The ichor that pooled around me was tainted, darkened by something I couldn't identify, yet it sustained my wretched existence, keeping me tethered to this accursed afterlife. Eventually, I stumbled into a new oval room. Among the grim black devices, I found a woman's face eerily similar to the one in the blue-lit control room. I waited for her eyes to open, and when they finally did, I recognized them. They were filled with a haunting familiarity. She spoke, her mouth masked and unmoving, but her voice resonated from the walls, a disembodied echo. The words began in Hindi, but twisted into something unintelligible as the connections around her head bulged and strained. Before I could react, the claw descended upon me, its chilling, spindly fingers wrapping around my body. I recognized that grip. It was the same that had snatched me from my grave and plunged me into the sinkhole. I was trapped, caught in a web of dread, expecting to be torn apart, killed, or worse, to become just another cog in this grotesque machine, just as I had always feared, even before I had been buried alive. The claw carried me through twisting tunnels of blue, gray, and sickly yellow until darkness enveloped me, a riotous sensation clawing at my stomach. I slammed into something hard and was thrown free into a slurry of mud and water, the grip of the storm releasing me. Somehow, the woman had summoned a shred of human willpower to eject me from the afterlife. I couldn't save her, but she had saved me, if only for a fleeting moment. I was back in the realm of the living, but the odyssey that began with my suicide attempt had left me shattered. I tried to tell the authorities about the horrors lurking beneath the earth, preying on the dead, but they only laughed at my madness. It was then that I learned a bit about Hindu customs. Most Hindus are cremated. Did their ancestors somehow know of the nightmare lurking below, stealing the buried? The graveyard where I had been entombed was a patchwork of various peoples and tribes, those who could afford cremation and unclaimed foreigners. Perhaps the storm had obliterated the entire site, as I had been told, but I suspected that the nightmare below had sealed the sinkhole, a tainted escape that had compromised that location. While trying to make sense of what I had experienced, I translated the Hindu woman's haunting phrases. They were worse than any horror I had witnessed. When we die, we stay where we lie. Our bones are dust, aware for all time. The words echoed in my mind, leaving me with a sense of chilling knowledge, a haunting paralysis born from the mouth of someone who had died and been rebuilt. Suicide is not the end, she had whispered. We must survive as long as we can, no matter the cause, for death is not the end. It is the beginning of a lonely agony that will never cease, no matter how desperately you long for it. I once thought being trapped in a box for days was hell, but now I knew death was worse. Now I traverse graveyard after graveyard, hoping and begging to encounter that underground nightmare once more. I crave to be part of the machine, part of the hell that lurks beneath. I would make a deal with the devil, or worse, with those slumbering entities in the basilica. Take my flesh, I would plead, if only so I may live and breathe in some form. For death is devoid of hope, devoid of peace. Death has no escape, no air holes, no freedom. It is the unbearable weight of being buried alive, trapped with nothing but your thoughts for all eternity.